Times are here, filling its hearts with fear. All who dear knows escape. Pounding your heart to God, listen the chastening road. Sing the way pilgrims trod, Christians away. Jesus is coming soon.
All right, Hebrews chapter 7. We're about to get into an in-depth study of an obscure character of the Old Testament by the name of Melchizedek. Now notice how I described him. I said he is what? Obscure. Okay? Now, to us, he is not. Okay? Most of us have heard of Melchizedek. We've heard about the priesthood of Melchizedek. We're very familiar with it. Let me ask you a question. In how many books of the Bible is Melchizedek mentioned? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 66. He is mentioned only in 3. 3 books is all he's mentioned in. There is the original account in the book of Genesis. Okay? Now guys, that is a very brief account, and we're going to read it tonight. It consists of only about 4 or 5 verses. I mean, it is just hit it and leave. Okay? He is also mentioned in the book of Hebrews, and that is the only New Testament book that mentions Melchizedek. Isn't that interesting? He's not mentioned by any other New Testament author other than the writer of the book of Hebrews. I just find that's interesting. Okay? The only other time he is mentioned is once in the Old Testament. Turn over to Psalm 110 and somebody read verse 4. Psalm 110, verse 4. Wow. Now, again, all of this stuff, when you really stop and you get to thinking about it, it ought to just fascinate you. Okay? And it ought to impress upon us that the Bible, the Scriptures, are the inspired Word of the living God. Now, what's interesting about Psalm 110, verse 4, is that is a messianic psalm. Okay? What do I mean by that? Okay? It is talking about Jesus, but what do we mean when we say it's a messianic psalm? Why do we... It is what? Okay? It is a prophecy of the Messiah. Okay? Now, were the Jews, or could the Jews understand and see certain passages as being messianic in nature? No, yes, no, yes, no, no, yes. Okay. Okay. Guys, there were passages that they knew were messianic in nature. Okay. Or if they didn't, if all the Old Testament was written and the Jews never understood that there is a Messiah coming, then they would never have been anticipating one. But they were, weren't they? You see, they could read the Old Testament and know that there's a king coming. There's a Messiah coming. There's an anointed one who is coming. And in all of the prophecies, only one of them mentions that the Messiah is going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. If something's mentioned only one time, do you have a tendency to kind of skip over it? Not think about it? Not put much importance to it? Yeah, it's easy to do, isn't it? Okay? Now something's said over and over and over and over, then you kind of pick up on it and you think, wow, yeah, this is important. And so, I just wonder, how much the Jews really were thinking about this priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. And it's going to take several years after the establishment of Christianity for any New Testament writer to make mention of it whatsoever. And it is the writer to the who? Hebrews. Question. Were the Jews extremely committed to an understanding of their history? Oh yes. Guys, let me tell you something. The Jews took the training of their children very seriously. Okay? And they grounded those children in those Old Testament stories. Okay? And these kids, they knew about these stories. So, in my mind, when a Jew hears about Melchizedek, even though they may not understand the importance of him, guess what they knew? They knew the story. And another reason they knew it is because it is closely connected to who? Abraham, their father, isn't it? It's an event in the life of Abraham, the father of the faithful. And so, yes, the Jews would have known about Melchizedek. They're familiar with the Old Testament story, but did they understand in the context of Psalm 110, verse 4, about the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek? I seriously doubt it. And now the writer of Hebrews is about to go into a fairly lengthy presentation of this encounter and this priesthood that is now in existence. Okay, guys, we are no longer living under what? The Levitical priesthood. It's gone. And guys, if the Levitical priesthood is gone, then that tells me that Judaism is gone. Has to be. And that's a wonderful question that you and I can ask our religious friends, can't we? Just go up to one of your friends, maybe he's a Jehovah's Witness, and folks, they believe in the Old Testament still, don't they? And a lot of individuals believe in the Old Testament. Just ask them, say, what priesthood are we living under today? I bet you there's a lot that don't even understand what priesthood we're living under today. They may even say, well, we're still living under the Levitical priesthood. You know that? They may have no conception of this priesthood that we're about to talk about. But if somebody says, we are living under the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, question 2, well then, are we still under the law of Moses? And the answer to that has to be what? No. If the priesthood has changed, then that tells me the law has changed. Okay? Extremely important. Okay? And it's a wonderful argument to hold on to show our religious neighbors that the Old Testament law is no longer our standard of authority and practice today. Okay? Because we live under this particular priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek. Thus far in the book of Hebrews, the writer has mentioned Melchizedek 3 times. Okay? 2 times in chapter 5 and once in chapter 6. Somebody read the very last verse of chapter 6. Poor things. They just... We're going to be here forever. I thought we wouldn't have enough notes. We keep this up, we're going to have plenty of notes. The last verse of Hebrews 6. Hear what he just did? He's just now introduced his subject for chapter 7. Now remember, originally the Bible wasn't divided into what? Chapters and verses. So here he is, he makes mention of, he says our high priest has gone where? Our high priest has gone into heaven, and he's the anchor of our soul there, is he not? And now I'm going to talk to you about this individual. I'm going to talk to you about this high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And he's going to spend the whole entire chapter of chapter 7 making the contrast and introducing this subject to us. And last week we looked at the 4 major points: the account from the Old Testament, the application to the Old Testament priesthood, the ascendancy of Jesus, and then lastly, the antithesis between the priesthoods. And so we're going to be looking at those 4 points over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. Let's begin with the account from the Old Testament, folks. The Old Testament story of Abraham and Melchizedek is found in Genesis, what? 14th chapter. Let's just turn there and let's just read it. I have it there in your notes. I'm not going to ask anybody else to read it. I'll read it because you'll have trouble. And the king of Salem went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is in the Kingsdale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Now that's all we read about with regard to Melchizedek in the Old Testament. Now folks, I want you to think about that. We're looking at how many verses? About 8 or 9 verses that formulate the entirety of the doctrine of the high priesthood in New Testament Christianity. Wow. Just unbelievable to me. Okay? Because Christ is a priest after the order of this individual. And so we need to understand what's going on. Note that Melchizedek is referred to as the priest of who? The Most High God. Do we read of any other priests in the pages of the Old Testament like or similar to this Melchizedek? Nobody remembers. There was at least one other. Now, I'm not saying he is identical to Melchizedek. All I'm saying is there was this priest that's just kind of out there that all of a sudden we read about. Nobody remembers him? Yeah, Jethro. Folks, Jethro, the father of, or the father-in-law of Moses, was a priest of God. Okay? Now, I wish I had more information about these priests and how they got established and how what they did and all of those. I don't know. Very limited information about these individuals. One question that I would have for God is this: were there even more of them? Well, once we get into I don't know that the Bible calls him a priest per se. Well, we have the patriarchs, right? And they're the heads of the families. And we know that God spoke to those men and that they operated as priests of their family. But then we have these unique guys that are specifically referred to as what? Priests. And priests of the Most High God. And I just find it interesting. I want to ask God one of these days, God, what did these priests do? Where were they located? Were there more than one of them? He might just tell me what? You don't need to know nothing. You made it here. Just go out there and enjoy. I don't know. But in this particular account, there's 2 things that are vital to understand or vital to see. Okay? As far as, which priesthood is greater. All right? One of the things is that Melchizedek blessed who? Abraham. And Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now, what's interesting to me, in our King James Version, it just says, and he gave tithes of all. If you're reading the text, it almost sounds like Melchizedek gave Abraham tithes of all. But that's not the way it is. And all of that is straightened out when you get into the book of Hebrews. Okay? So we have Melchizedek blessing Abraham. Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek. And, you know, the Old Testament story just goes on. Doesn't say another word about him until Psalm 110 verse 4. And then never says another word about him until the book of Hebrews. Still just blows my mind. But it's interesting. The Hebrew penman uses the account to make an important point about the Levitical priesthood. And he'll do that in verses 5 through 10. First, he simply sets the account before us. Okay? He just rehearses the account and tells us some interesting things about Melchizedek that the Old Testament account doesn't tell us. And guys, these are pretty powerful statements that he's about to make. Yes, sir.
Do you have an opinion as to who he was other than King of Salem? And so on?
Nope. I mean, well, I've got an opinion. Yeah. Right. Exactly right. And when we get into it a little bit more, I'll express that. Okay? I'll talk about it some more. Let's just keep going for right now, and we'll get to that. Let's talk. I find it interesting that he immediately begins with the action that took place. Okay? The action that took place. The two things that I just told you about. The blessing and the what? Because those are the two things that are vital to understand. Now, the other stuff is vital. Those two things prove his point that he's trying to make in this chapter. Notice what he says. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all. He just immediately sets the 2 points right in front of us, doesn't he? Okay? Guys, when you're arguing your points, guess what? You argue your points. You know what? And that's what he wants us to understand. These are the 2 points that he wants you to understand that are vital to understand. Okay? Notice that his name, Melchizedek. And that name means what? King of righteousness. King of righteousness. Folks, names are often given to individuals because of certain qualities that those individuals either were going to possess or did possess at a certain time. What was Israel's name in the beginning? Jacob. Did that name mean anything? It was changed to Israel, wasn't it? Did Jacob mean anything? What did it mean? Yes, a supplanter, a deceiver, a liar. How would you like to be born and your mama name you that? You just a little liar. Come here, little liar. I mean that's what his name, every time they said his name, that was the connotation. And guess what? He grew up and he matched his name, didn't he? Now, fortunately, all that changed, and he was given a new name, okay? But he matched his name. Now, here, this man's name is what? King of righteousness. Tells me 2 things. He's a king, or going to be, and he's what? He's righteous. He's righteous. Turn over to Hebrews 1 for just a minute. Let's go back there for just a second. Hebrews 1, 8 and 9. But unto the Son he saith, Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. Watch this. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. Thou hast loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even thy God, hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. Wow. Who is that talking about in Hebrews 1? That's talking about Jesus, folks. Okay? Now, the reason I do this is because we're trying to make a comparison between who? Melchizedek and Jesus Christ. Okay? And one of them involves who they are and their nature. Both of them are kings. Both of them are righteous. Okay? Righteous. When we think of a righteous person, what do we think of? Huh? Well, what's that mean? A person who's living right. Ah, there you go. A person who's living right. Okay? That's basically what righteousness is. The Bible says, "He that is righteous doeth righteousness." Now, the question is, what is righteousness? Psalm 119, 172 says, "All thy commandments are righteousness." Folks, a person who is righteous is doing right. A person who is righteous is doing righteousness. A person who is righteous is doing the commands of God. Question: can we be righteous? Larry's down here said, "You better be." Absolutely, folks. You see, God enables us to be righteous as well. Okay? But here's Melchizedek, king of Salem. And so we got two kings, Jesus and Melchizedek, two righteous men, Jesus and Melchizedek, don't we? King of Salem. Folks, that name means peace. It comes from the Hebrew word shalom. Heard that word? Shalom. The Jews say that a lot. They say that in their greeting, and they say that in their departing one with another. Peace be upon you, or peace be unto you as they leave. Shalom. And so the city of Jerusalem was originally named Salem. It's interesting, isn't it? The city of peace. And now we have this king, and he's the king of the city of peace. Wow. Notice what Isaiah says in Isaiah 9:6. "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." Folks, Jesus is also what? A Prince of Peace. Okay? Just as who was? Just as Melchizedek was. Let me ask you, I said that the name Jerusalem originally was Salem. How in the world did it get to be Jerusalem then? Did you hear those last ones? Salim, Shalom, Salem. See, the end part of Jerusalem is Salem. Okay? But where did that first part come from? Jerusalem. Why do they call it that now? Nobody knows? No. There was a tribe, Canaanites, who lived in the land, who occupied that particular portion of the country. Guess who they were? The Jebusites. So you put the two together, Jebusalem, and all they did was eventually develop that name into Jerusalem. A dwelling place of the Jebusites, but the city of Salem. And they put those two together, and it became Jerusalem. And it was, notice that he is a priest of the Most High God, and that's where he is ruling and reigning as king, isn't he? Jesus rules and reigns over Let me start over. Melchizedek was king of what city? Salem or Jerusalem. Jesus is king over what city? New Jerusalem. Right? Whose builder and maker is God. And folks, that's what? That's the church, is it not? And the Bible talks about the New Jerusalem and seeing the New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven. And folks, Jesus is the King over the New Jerusalem. You see the parallels between Melchizedek and Jesus? It's interesting stuff. Notice that the text says that he met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings. Everybody knows the story, right? The kings had come in, had a war, and they had taken who? Lot. Abraham finds out that they've taken Lot. He amasses his men. He goes after them. He slays the kings and rescues Lot. And as he's coming home, guess who meets him? Melchizedek. Okay, so he puts that in there to let us know that he's talking about that Old Testament account. Okay, the slaughter of the kings over there in the King's Dale. So it's the exact same story here as back there in the book of Genesis. Notice his text says, and he what? Blessed him. He blessed him. To speak well of, that is religiously to bless, thank, or invoke a benediction upon. A benediction that means, I want you to prosper. Thayer says to praise, to celebrate with praises, to invoke. Melchizedek comes out and he expresses an approbation over all the things that Abraham has done. You've taken the victory, you've won over these kings, and what does he do? He praises and he gives all these accolades to this man. But the interesting thing is what? The less is always blessed of the greater. Think about that. Melchizedek blesses Abraham. The less is blessed of the better. Who's the less? Abraham. But we don't like saying that, do we? You know? Because Abraham's the father of the Jews, and now we have somebody in the Old Testament that's what? Better than Abraham. Because he what? He blessed him. Melchizedek was better. And it's a very, very important point that he's trying to get across. Notice the next point. He says, to whom Abraham gave what? A tenth of all. Now, Genesis said that he gave him what? Tithes. Right here we come to see a divinely inspired definition of what a tithe is, don't we? A tithe is a what? A tenth. Okay? And the Bible defines it for us right here. And so he paid tithes, he paid a tenth to Melchizedek. Notice the point. That's always who? To the greater. Now we have Abraham paying tithes to Melchizedek, so who's the greater? Oh, doesn't that just tear you up? Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. Oh, doesn't even sound right, does it? But it's true. And it is a vital point that was made in the Old Testament for something to come in the New. Okay? And it's important to us. Now, in verses 2b through 3, the inspired writer gives us a description, a detailed description of Melchizedek. Okay? And it's a description that we are not given in the book of Genesis. Okay? And it's interesting because it parallels, guess who? Jesus Christ. Notice what it says. First being by interpretation King of righteousness, and after that also King of Salem, which is King of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest, what? Continually. Folks, right here is where the discussion of Melchizedek gets very interesting. This is where Larry was wanting my opinion. Okay? And I think I put on a post yesterday, my opinion, and a buck will get you a cup of coffee at the restaurant. And somebody came along and said, no, you can't even get a cup of coffee for a buck at the restaurant anymore. But that's about true. Notice point A. Many try to make this description of Melchizedek very difficult. Okay? Even mystical in nature. Okay? Now here's where I'm putting forth my opinion. Okay? And my opinion is as good as yours, isn't it? That's another point I made. Whoever's got opinions, that one opinion is as good as the other. Okay? But notice what I say. Let us remember that Melchizedek was a real human character of the Old Testament. Isn't that the way he's described? He's a what? He's a priest. He's described as a king. He's described as a king of an earthly city. It isn't like he was just some figure that just all of a sudden pops up and then disappears and goes away. Now in the biblical text that's what happened, but when Abraham went back to his home, guess where Melchizedek went back to? Melchizedek went back to Salem in order to be king and priest there. That was his job. That was his duty. Now, watch this. Because of the lack of information provided in the Old Testament account about Melchizedek, the inspired writer can now take that and make application of it to who? To Jesus Christ. Okay? And that's what I say in the next point. The description that is given comes from what is revealed to us about this man in the Old Testament. Okay? I've already made mention of the fact that he's a king of what? King of righteousness and a king of peace. So we won't talk about that anymore. Now notice he goes into now his genealogy. Okay? Without father, without mother, without what? Without descent. Now, here's what he means by that. You go back and read the Old Testament, right? Account of Melchizedek, and I can ask, well, who's Melchizedek's father? What are you going to say? I don't know. Who's Melchizedek's mother? I don't know. Who's Melchizedek's children? I don't know. Without mother, without father, without descent. Okay? Now that's based on just the stuff we read in the Old Testament. Okay? But guys, it's parallel to who? To Jesus Christ. Okay? And that's what's so interesting. There are no historical records that reveal to us who his mother and father were. Thus, it appears that he had what? Neither. Okay? Indicating that he's what? If you don't have a mother and you don't have a father, then you didn't really have a point of what? Beginning, did you? Now, folks, if you don't have a point of beginning, then you are what? You are eternal in nature. Okay? And only who has that? Only God is eternal, isn't he? Okay? And so it looks as though Melchizedek is what? An eternal being. Okay? Now, some individuals will say, well, see there, that tells me that Melchizedek was Jesus in the Old Testament. Folks, if that be the case, then Jesus was incarnated twice. Did you know that? Because he was a man when Abraham saw him. Okay, and he was a king, and he was operating as a priest at that time. Okay, Jesus wasn't incarnated twice. He was only incarnated once. He only took upon him the form of flesh once, and that's when he was born in the city of Bethlehem. Thou hast prepared for me a body, one body, and that was through who? Through Mary, wasn't it? Okay, and so that's the reason I believe, yes, he was a man, but he was not Jesus Christ. Notice what else he goes on to say. He talks about his birth and death. Having neither beginning of days nor End of life. Wow. He wasn't born, and we never read about his what? His death. He's what? He's eternal. He's eternal. Again, I just find it interesting that God writes the Old Testament in such a way that He can take that account now, hundreds and thousands of years later, and apply it to who? To Jesus Christ. How do you do that? And if Moses was not inspired as he wrote that account, how would he have known to do that? He wouldn't have, would he? Wouldn't have known to do that whatsoever. Okay? Now notice the points. He had no mother or father who gave birth to him, but he existed. There is no record of his death. Thus, he appears to continue to exist. Notice, priests continued in their capacity until they what? Until they died, didn't they? And folks, once you died, guess what? Your priesthood came to an end. The Melchizedekian priesthood still what? Still continues. It's an eternal priesthood, folks. Okay? An eternal priesthood. Melchizedek did not die. His priesthood was everlasting in nature. But notice what he says. Now watch with the terminology. But made like unto who? The Son of God. Made like unto the Son of God. Okay? He's not who? He's not the Son of God. But he was made like unto who? The Son of God. Okay? And that's only because of the way God handled the writing of the Old Testament text. He wanted Melchizedek to be a type of who? Of Jesus Christ. And he did that by his being a king, by his being a priest, by his being over the city of Salem, by his being righteous, by his having no mother, no father, no beginning of days, no end of days, by his being eternal, being made like unto the Son of God. A what? A priest forever. Folks, that's something that needs to be understood. Okay? Like unto a Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Jesus too is an eternal being, had no beginning or end. This refutes the claim of the Jehovah's Witnesses that Jesus is a what? Created being. It refutes the claim of the Mormons that Jesus is a created being. It refutes the claim of Islam that Jesus is a created being. He is not. He is what? He is eternal. Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, I am. I have always existed. Folks, Jesus is an eternal being. This is the reason that Christianity is so great and so wonderful, and the reason that it outshines all of the denominations and all of the false religions and world religions of the day. We serve an eternal God, not some man who has a beginning and an ending. He leaves in verse 4 and he gives us the consideration. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of spoils. Folks, he wants us to understand what? We are dealing with an unbelievable person when we talk about who? Melchizedek. Abraham, was he great? Yes. Was he wonderful? Yes. But guess what? There was a being back there in the Old Testament who is even greater. And we know that because Abraham did what? Paid tithes to the man. And the less always pays tithes to who? The greater. And guys, he's about to take those 2 points. And guess what he's about to do? He's about to show these Jewish Christians who want to go back to Judaism, who want to go back to the Levitical law, how useless that law is. Why do you want to go back to that law? Why do you want to go back to the Levitical law? Why don't you want to live under the what? Priesthood of Melchizedek. An eternal priesthood. So we'll talk about that next week, guys. That's just good stuff. Gives me chills when I think about it.